Hi, my name is Steven, and thanks for joining me in my very first video. This is my studio, and in here we're going to build, paint, experiment, and probably mess some stuff up. So if you've ever wanted to learn something cool or you want to do a new project, this is the channel for you. Today we're going to take a resin 3D print. We're going to process it by sanding it. We're going to decorate the base, and then we're going to paint it. It's going to be a very simple process, and I hope you enjoy. Princess Mononoke is my favorite Studio Ghibli movie. I saw this beautiful 3D model from Bulkmancer, and I knew I had to paint this. When working with cured resin, make sure you're wearing a respirator. We're going to sand some rough areas where the supports were attached, then we're going to use this mini vacuum to remove the dust. Some of the resin wasn't fully washed off, so we're going to drop a little isopropyl alcohol and remove it with an old toothbrush. Next, we're going to start assembling the base. The glue I'm using can double as a gap filler, so let's spread some around the larger seams with a little makeup brush. You can be pretty liberal with the glue as it will fill the gaps between pieces when you squeeze it together, then spread the excess around with the same little brush. Make sure you test fit the pieces as you go to ensure a snug fit, and make sure you got a good grip. The last thing you want to do is... Thankfully resin's pretty strong, but you know, let's try not to break anything. Now that Moro is done, we'll plant these little ferns to make sure they still fit, but we won't glue them in place just yet. For our next step, we're going to enhance the base with some plants and some grass. And we're also going to use epoxy sculpt, basing glue, and actually a little bit of hand moisturizer. We'll tie it all together with some AK Dark Earth. First, let's mix some epoxy sculpt together to fill some larger gaps the glue couldn't handle. Take an equal part from both jars and mix them together. Once the color is consistent, start working it into the gaps. Dab a little of that moisturizer on your tool and it'll help smooth the epoxy and make it easier to work with. I like to use sculpting tools so I can match the details of the surrounding areas. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can always fix it later. I rolled a little snaky snake to fit that snake-shaped gap in Moro's back. And to smooth that out, I mixed a small amount of epoxy with isopropyl alcohol to create a paste that can be applied with an old brush. I also used it to smooth some of my previous handiwork on the stump. I love this stuff. You can paint it over gaps and areas where you need some texture to hide your mistakes. I'm using it to blend that big gap in the stump. I'm also going to apply an even layer over the surface of the ground. It's going to add a lot of texture that's really going to stand out once we hit that with some dry brushing later on. Now these little tufts are usually for miniatures such as your warhammers and what have you, but they also add some visual interest to large scale bases. I've got some fancy army painter glue here, but any clear drying craft glue will do just fine. So just tweeze those little guys anywhere you fancy a bush. Let's sprinkle on some leaf litter to add detritus. It's a forest floor after all, the place would be lousy with detritus. I've mixed some Mod Podge with water and I'm dabbling it on the ground, then sprinkling that detritus where I see fit, like between rocks and plants, you know, places where you'd expect detritus to accumulate. Do your best to channel the god of the forest when you're working on this kind of stuff. Our final step is using that same Mod Podge mixture to adhere some moss to some mossy areas. This is just called Moss Texture from AK, and it's part of their Diorama series of basing materials. It can be easy to get carried away with this stuff, like you'll notice I'm detailing this part of the log that San is sitting on. You're never gonna see it, but you know what? It's fun, so if you're having a good time, just do it. So let's prep for paint. I've skewered my pieces on bamboo sticks with a little masking tape on the end to create a snug fit. We don't want them shooting across the room when you start airbrushing. I've also used some nice little alligator clips for smaller pieces, and make sure to admire your handiwork now and then. Nice job, Steven. Time to prime. So there's no art to this really, just blast everything with black paint. Anything that's going to end up white at the end, like Morrow or the fur on Sand's back, you should prime white, of course. Make sure to prime all the pieces, and if you've got any paint left over, make sure to prime a Pokemon for later. And once you're done priming, just make sure to test fit everything again for a satisfying video clip. Next, we're going to add a Zenithal highlight to the sculpture. Zenithal highlighting is a miniature painting technique that simulates natural light from above by priming a model in dark colors and applying lighter top-down highlights. I like to pretend your airbrush is the sun and you're blasting ultraviolet radiation, illuminating the areas sunbeams would hit. You may want that to be the focal point or where you want to lead your viewer's eye when they're gazing upon your masterpiece. Nothing will be absolute black, so spin your lazy Susan around and be sure everything gets at least a little sunlight. I started laying down some base colors using contrast paint from Games Workshop. This brown is called Snakebite Leather. I want to make sure that the application is patchy with hue shifts to create interesting patterns. Next, I'll spray some green and give all the grass a base coat and start working up the base of the stump to create a nice mossy transition. I hand painted the mushrooms and added some highlights to the edge of the stump. Not sure why I bothered since sound will be sitting on it obscuring all that wonderful paintwork. I really wanted the mushrooms to look soft and velvety, so I'm going to use the same color and airbrush the center of the cap. Look at that overspray. Time to bust out some note cards to mask the ground. I'll squeeze a little AK lime green on my palette and dry brush across the ground, making sure to accentuate the mossy areas and those lovely ferns. We can give the rock some love too. Let's paint the skin starting with a fluorescent pink. This will act as the blood vessel layer, or what you'd look like without skin. Next, we're going to build up layers of darker reds in the shadow areas, and then lightly tint the lighter areas with the same color. Hopefully we're going to blend the hot pink and the darker red together just subtly enough for the next step. The first skin colored layer comes in and blends those two together. You can lower the PSI on your compressor and go slow, layer by layer, until you have something you're happy with. You could stop here, but I find the result to lack warmth and saturation, so I'll add a little orcish dermis before finishing with a basic skin tone from AK. Get your favorite putty, create a mask to protect that beautiful skin, and then you can paint the dress. You can also hand paint some of the smaller deets like these cute little wolf ears. Now we can paint these little guys. I use Pearly Gates by Turbo Dork to give the Kodomos a very ethereal and kind of sparkly paint job. Start with a white base and do a couple of coats. From here, it's all the details. Take off that putty mask and fill in some of the missing dress with that same blue color. I like to use brush soap and a sponge to keep the tip nice and sharp so that you can really get into those fine details. I create what I call flow by mixing in thinner medium and water, and then using a little pipette to drop some on my wet palette. I feel like it works really well with acrylic paints and helps the paint spread real evenly. For white, I use golden titanium. I don't think any of the mini paint companies have figured out quite yet how to make a good white. And yeah, check out my magnifying glasses. They're pretty goofy, but essential when you're making tiny little clothes for tiny little anime women. For San's lips, I'm using a little Magos Purple contrast paint. I settled on doing an oil wash for Moro's fur. What you do is mix some mineral spirits into a blob of oil paint until you have a milky consistency, then let it drip off your brush into all the recesses. You'll get a richer color the deeper the recesses, as the oil will accumulate there. I chose an ochre color because even though the white fur looks white, most furs will have a yellow tinge to it. From here, it's just tightening up little details and admiring a job well done. She might look harmless, but I wouldn't mess with her. Yamero! Time to finish Moro, and we'll start by painting that snoot. I'm using a gray contrast paint here so I can build up layers and control the consistency with contrast medium. Doing so will allow me to paint her long lashes, dark lips, and add some shadow to the recessed areas of her face. If you work quickly, you can use some pure contrast medium to blend the edges of the paint, creating smooth transitions. Next, I'm going to airbrush her fur with a brown to accentuate the larger shapes and forms of her body. I'll do the same for San before finally dry brushing with pure white, hitting just the tops of all those tufts. That pretty much wraps it up. So let's take a look at the final reveal. Thank you so much for watching my very first video. If you enjoyed it, please let me know, and more importantly, let me know how I can improve. Should I go into more detail? Do you want to see every step of the process? What would you like to see next? More painting or something completely different? Either way, I hope to see you next time. Bye. So we're going to keep looking for projects that need to be finished. Let's see. Oh my God. What the? Okay. All right. We're going.